All right, we're looking at question 14 again because we didn't get through the notes on this particular question last night. But just in summary, before we go back and do the question again, we closed last week with a discussion of the fact that when Adam and Eve sinned in the garden in Genesis chapter 3, it ruined everything. Didn't just, a lot of times we hear about that account and it's referred to as the fall of man. The fall of man, which I really don't agree with that. I don't agree with that assessment because it was the fall of Adam and Eve. It wasn't my fall. It wasn't the fall of all mankind. It was the fall of all the people that were living at the time. But each one of us is responsible for our own sins and our own transgressions. It was the fall of Adam and Eve. But not only did that sin bring about death for Adam and Eve, it also brought about death for everything in the universe. And that's where we closed off last week, and we'll pick up there again after we go back and do question 14 again, which is verse number 20. Verse number 20. It says, "For the creation was subjected to what? Vanity. To vanity or to futility." It says, "Not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope, because the creation itself will also be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God." And so here's where we closed off last week. That and I noted what I thought Cottrell gave was a very good summary there of verse 20 and 21. That's actually verse 14, or question 14 is verses 20 and 21. And he notes that creation was given as man's servant, but through man's sin became his adversary. Just again by way of example, when Adam lived in the garden, everything he needed was right there at his fingertips. And his only responsibility was to tend and keep the garden. To tend and keep the garden. But after Adam and Eve sinned, God pronounced a curse not only on Adam and Eve, but also on the ground itself. If you look at, for example, in Genesis chapter 3, and in verse number 17, it says, "Because you have heeded the voice of your wife, and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it, cursed is the ground for your sake." In other words, before this, the ground was Adam's friend. It says, "In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you shall return." And so God cursed the entirety of the creation. When Adam and Eve were living in the garden, before there was sin in the world, there being no sin, there was also no death of any kind. There was no bloodshed of any kind. A lot of people miss some of the language in Genesis chapter 1 and also in Genesis chapters 6 and 7 that teach us that when God made everything and he was finished with it, every living creature on the face of the earth was a vegetarian. There were no predators. There was no prey. When you read Genesis chapter 1, God says, "I've given the grass and the green herb to you and everything else for food." In other words, animals didn't eat other animals. Then when you get to Genesis 6 and 7, when God has Noah to prepare the ark, and he gets ready to get on the ark, the Bible says, gather up all the green grass and whatnot for food for you and everything that's on the ark. And so for 1,656 years, there was no predators and prey among the animal kingdom. And the only bloodshed, by and large, was the bloodshed that man inflicted on other men, and the bloodshed that was inflicted upon animals for animal sacrifice. Now, after Noah and his family got off the ark, God said, I have put the fear of all the animals in you. But I mean, you think about for 1,656 years, you could walk up to any animal on the planet, just like it was your personal pet. In other words, the fear of man was not in any single animal. And so, there being no sin, there was no purpose for death, no reason for death. And I would go so far as to say, given the language in this text, that there was not going to be death of man, animals, or plants. And then I think there's even an extended sense in which that the universe itself was not subject to decay. Because the text says that when sin entered into the world, the entirety of creation was then subject to corruption. In other words, everything began to die. Everything began to decay. And so that's where we closed off last week, just to imprint in our minds the enormity of the problem of sin. You know, sometimes people have a very shallow view of sin. You know, it's just a little sin. You know, it's not that big a deal. Well, you know, all it was eating fruit that God said not eat, right? You know, nobody got beat up. You know, nobody got murdered. You know, nobody got kidnapped. You know, nobody got assaulted. And yet that one event set in motion the destruction and the decay of the entire creation. And so, you know, if what we might think of as one minor transgression did all of that, then we need to understand the enormity of sin. We can in some way begin to fathom the enormity of sin in our own lives. And so I made some notes there about the bondage of corruption with regard to the decay of all the creation. And it says, note that it was subject to decay by sin, and will be liberated from the same at the revealing of the sons of God. Now, let's look at verse 21, the deliverance there, that third paragraph. Verse 21's deliverance of the creation from decay into the liberty of the children of God has caused much disturbance among the commentators. And as I was going back and looking over this, I'm thinking it was Moses Lard who made mention of this text, that one commentator spent 7 pages on this one verse and presented 11 different possibilities of what had been postulated as to the meaning of it. All right, and then another commentator gave like 6 or 7 postulates or theories about what it meant, and he had dedicated 5 pages to expounding on those. And I tell you that just to say that, you know, if men that are a whole lot smarter than we are have not come to a conclusion about what this text means in a very concrete way, then it would be foolish for us to try to do the same. In other words, the best, you know, I think in this particular case, the best that we can do is draw some type of conclusion that does not violate some passage of Scripture in another place. Like when Satan quoted Psalm 91, Jesus said, well, it's written in another place, thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God. In other words, yes, you've quoted the Bible, but your interpretation of it and application of it is in contradiction to another text. And so, what we need to understand is that there, are at least among the church two prominent views as to what all of this means. All right, and I actually presented three views, and the first one is one I absolutely don't think is correct. It says that the creation refers to Christians and hinges on the idea conveyed in 2 Corinthians 5:17 that those who are in Christ are a new creation. And this is the view of Robertson and Whiteside. Now, I have gleaned much and benefited much from Whiteside's commentary on Romans, but this will not be one of those things. I just don't think that application fits the context. For example, the language of the immediate context. And then note this, even Whiteside said that though his view might not be correct, it accords with what the Scriptures elsewhere say concerning the present condition and future destiny of Christians. Well, that might be true, that his conclusion accords with what the text says in other places, but the problem is, I think the text under consideration won't do that. Does that make sense? In other words, I don't think the language permits for Whiteside's conclusions, even though what he says is in keeping with what the Bible says in other places. Kind of like how about this? Now is the accepted time, and today is the day of salvation. 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 2. All right, so you hear that verse many times, probably most of the time, if you ever hear that verse, it's given in the invitation, right? You hear the preacher say, at the time for extending the invitation, now is the accepted time, and today is the day of salvation. Well, that's true, right? It is true. But that verse doesn't teach it. In other words, they've applied a meaning to that verse that the statement itself is true, but that verse doesn't teach it. Or, this is the day that the Lord hath made, and I will rejoice and be glad in it. People look outside and they see a pretty day. This is the day that the Lord hath made, I will rejoice and be glad in it. Well, but every day is a day that the Lord's made, right? Even the dreary ones like yesterday, right? Even the days that we're not that crazy about. The point is, every day is a day that the Lord has made, and we ought to rejoice every single day in what God's done for us. But that verse doesn't teach that. All right, so that's what I'm getting at with Whiteside. What he says is true about Christians and being new creatures and the future glory. It's just that this verse doesn't teach it. All right, now to the second. And by the way, Whiteside's views, I don't think very commonly held. I didn't really see it anywhere else in any of my studies. All right. The second view is that all of the physical creation will be redeemed and restored to its original condition as God made everything in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. It says Genesis 1, but Genesis 1 and 2 are the same time frame, essentially the same events. And this view is known among our brethren as the renewed creation, the restored creation, but more commonly it's called in circles among our people as the new heavens, new earth idea. All right, the new heavens, new earth idea. Now, top of the next page. I was 50 years old before I ever heard this view. All right? I was 50 years old before I ever heard this idea that God was going to just renew and restore everything like it used to be when God created it and called it very good. All right? But what that goes to show you is that just because we may not have heard of a thing just because it may be new to us, does not mean that it is new. All right? And, for example, Alexander Campbell held this view. Now look, Alexander Campbell is nothing to us. He's not any type of authority or anybody to be revered in any particular way. I'm just simply telling you that Alexander Campbell held this view. And so, that goes back almost 200 years in the Restoration movement. Okay? Moses Lard held this view. And Lard wrote a really good commentary on Romans that I have used a lot. But Lard held this particular view. Then more recently, for example, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, right in there, G.C. Brewer held this view. And that name, look, if you haven't been in the church a long time or you haven't done a lot of study of the mid-20th century preachers, you may not know who G.C. Brewer was. I think at one time he was the associate editor of the Gospel Advocate. All right? But Brewer held this view. And so what I'm telling you is that there were a number of respected men through the course of the Restoration movement who have held this view that were not crackpots. In other words, it's not some far out crackpot view, because Lard's commentary on Romans is not even based on any translation of the text. It's on his own personal translation of the Greek language. He translated the book from the Greek and then wrote a commentary on it. All right? That dude's smart. Right? That guy knows the book. All right? So I'm just telling you that these men held it. All right? Now, in modern times, this view is beginning to gain popularity. I think in part because particularly a lot of our younger guys are enamored with denominational preachers such as N.T. Wright, who holds this view, has written a book about this view. And by the way, young preachers holding denominational preachers in high esteem, rightfully or wrongfully so, is also not a new thing. Clarence McCartney was a denominational writer back in the 40s and 50s, and a lot of young men were enamored with him back in the day. Again, I'm just telling you, these things are not new to us, either in the teaching or perhaps in the source of the belief of it. All right? I could probably name 10 guys that I know personally that hold this view. All right? And there is no problem between us. They hold it and I don't. I know they hold it, they know I don't. And there are no issues between us on this thing. All right? And I think that's the way it should be. Again, because good men on both sides have held differing views as to what this means. Now, for me, all right, still top of the page, our first paragraph. I find the view a bit untenable in light of most of what the Bible says or implies concerning the future state of man. Now let me just in a very, and this is probably a very crude, and what I mean by crude is an oversimplified way. The new heavens, new earth theory, as I understand it, is that after the judgment, that God is going to recreate the earth in the way that He did at the beginning, but that heaven and earth will somehow be joined together as one. Not a heaven and an earth, but in some way that heaven and earth will be consummated together, and that God will dwell on a renewed or reconstituted earth. Again, that's probably a gross oversimplification, but that's the best way that I understand it. Now, there's probably not a one of you in here that's ever heard that in your life, have you? Never heard it in your life, all right? But all right, stop right there. For those of you that are watching online, somebody who will remain unnamed mentioned the Jehovah's Witnesses. All right? I'm going to talk about the Jehovah's Witnesses in a minute. All right? Hush. 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 I'll get to the Jehovah's Witnesses in just a minute. Okay? I promise. It's right here in black and white. All right. But most of us, particularly in this area, have never heard of this in our whole lives. All right? And the chances are you're never going to hear it again. Because I don't believe it. I don't hold to it. Therefore, I don't teach it. All right? But I just want you to know that there is a significant number of guys out there who do hold this view, and they're gaining in their popularity through their podcasts and whatnot. Again, whether or not they hold the view, to me, is not important. Number one, it doesn't have anything to do, it has absolutely nothing to do with what a person has to do to be saved. It doesn't have anything to do with the structure, the organization, or the worship of the church. It doesn't have anything to do with the type of life that you have to live in order to go to heaven. It's only a difference of opinion as to what heaven is going to be like. That's all that it is. You know, these guys think that there's going to be some type of blending together of heaven and earth, and that heaven and earth will be somehow joined together, and that God will dwell there and will dwell there. And by the way, Moses' Lord went as far as to say that even there'll be animals there. All right? It's right there in his commentary. Because the text says that the entirety of the creation will be redeemed. That's what it says in the text. And his view is, first of all, that the creation means everything other than man. Because there's already the discussion of the revealing of the sons of men. That's Christians. And so then whatever the entirety of the creation is something that is separate from men. And so he held the view that even birds would sing, and that, again, just like Genesis 1. Okay, just like Genesis 1. Right? Again, it's just, all it is a difference in what heaven is. Is heaven going to be what all of us have always been taught and believed, or is it going to be something else other than what we've been? But it all pertains to what happens after the judgment. And I just don't see the need for all of the hullabaloo that a lot of the people have created over this. All right? And so but you know, when I start thinking about things, and by the way, for those that believe it that might be watching this, they're going to say I'm not being fair, and I'm not, because I'm going to tell you what I believe and why I believe it. Okay? For example, the language of the Bible, the overwhelming, to me, from what I read, the overwhelming language of the Bible tells me that heaven is not going to be here. You know, it talks about that. Where is, like, for example, where is Jesus now? He's in heaven. All right. And he says, I'm going to go and prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and what? Receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also. That doesn't sound like Jesus is coming back to this earth and staying. All right? Yeah, 2 Peter 3:10 to me is problematic, that when the Lord comes back, it's all going to get burned up. Yeah, everything's going to be dissolved. It's all going to be burned up. Of course, their answer is that it's going to be a recreation. It's going to be a recreation of some form of what it used to be. But I'm with you. 2 Peter 3:10 is extremely problematic. All right. I think about, and this is not a verse that's even designed to teach anything about heaven, so to speak. But for example, in Acts 2 and verse 34. When Peter was preaching on the day of Pentecost, and he was talking about David, okay? He says, let me freely speak to you about the patriarch David. That God had sworn an oath to him that of the fruit of his loins he'd raise up a seed to sit on his throne, an heir to sit on his throne. All right. Well, obviously he's talking about Jesus. Okay. But then he says in verse 34, "For David is not yet ascended into the heavens." Again, here's what I'm thinking. Why would Peter make that statement about David is not yet ascended into the heavens if it's all going to be combined into one? You have, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. The Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, the voice of the archangel, and the trump of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. And we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them to meet with the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. Again, that doesn't sound like, for lack of a better term, heaven on earth, or heaven and earth as one. All the texts that talk about, we are waiting for Jesus to return. He's in heaven. He's going to return from heaven, and he's going to take us back to heaven. That's always been my understanding. And so, but let me just say this: I see where somebody would draw that other conclusion based on Romans 8. I mean, you see what I'm saying? I can see how somebody can draw that conclusion. I just think there are explanations that don't warrant it, plus the rest of the text. For example, and this was in Truth for Today. I believe it was Paul Pollard's commentary. This idea of the creation is waiting for deliverance is a literary device known as personification. In other words, it applies human attributes to non-human things, whether it be animals or plants. And Pollard's view is, since we do have this, because obviously the trees aren't waiting for the second coming of Jesus. All my dead dogs are not waiting for the second coming of Jesus, and my living ones aren't looking for him either. All right, and so there's this literary device known as personification. And so because Paul is speaking in personification, we don't want to press all of the matters in the text too literally, because he's obviously not speaking in an absolute literal way. So that's problematic for me as well. You look at for example and I've never heard anybody use this, and so I could be off base in using it myself, but John spent an awful lot of time in Revelation 21 and 22 describing heaven, right? I mean, he used a lot of crazy figures, right? Streets of gold, but the gold is so pure that it's clear as glass. Gates of pearl, 12 foundations of precious stones. All right? Now, here's where I'm going with this. There were a lot of people who lived in the world prior to the flood. In other words, that had some concept in some way of the world as God created it. Never rained, water, rose up out of the ground. No animals, animals didn't fear one another. Everybody's a vegetarian. Everybody's a vegetarian. No animal ate any other animals. Men didn't eat animals until after Noah got off the ark. And I'm like, all right, so the world as God created it has already been described in Genesis 1, right? Genesis 1 and 2. And John's description of it seems extremely strange if all we have to do is go back and read Genesis 1 and 2. Does that make sense? In other words, how does one read the description of heaven in Revelation 21 and 22 and draw the conclusion that it's going to be exactly the way that God made it in Genesis 1 and 2? with the 12 foundations of precious stones and the sea of glass, the streets of gold and the gates of pearl. You see where I'm going with this? There's just way too much in those 2 chapters trying to describe heaven when you've got people who lived essentially in that, that perfect, pre-sin world, or in the time immediately after, sin entered into the world. But the world was still pretty incredible, before the flood. All right, and so the idea of the descriptive terms of heaven just don't accord with this idea that it's going to be exactly like it was when God first made it in Genesis 1 and 2. Now, I love you, right? Okay. Before I leave this, I have to warn and speak with regard to those who refer to this doctrine as Jehovah's Witness doctrine. Because that's what a lot of my brethren do. They call it Jehovah's Witness doctrine. I wrote a very lengthy Facebook note in September of 2019 on brethren who hold differing views on this need to be brethren, and quit fussing and fighting over this and making false accusations, one of which is New Heavens, New Earth guys believe Jehovah's Witness doctrine. It's just not true. It's just not true. And I'll tell you why. What did I tell you that our brethren hold about heaven and earth? What are they going to do? But after it's all said and done, what's going to happen? Heaven and earth are going to do what? Become one, right? In other words, it's going to be like, heavens and earth will be somehow joined together, right? And this is what heaven will be, all right? This is not Jehovah's Witness doctrine. Jehovah's Witness doctrine holds that heaven is still up here and only 144,000 get to go. And then earth is still down here, and people who are saved but not part of the 144,000 get to live down here in paradise on earth. You see how these two things are completely separate? And that there's a specific group of people that get to go here and everybody else gets to go down here. You see how those two things are not the same. The new heavens, new earth doctrine. Now look, the Jehovah's Witnesses refer to this down here as the new heavens and new earth. That's what they call the new heavens and new earth. But it's not the same thing as what some of our brethren believe. You see, not 144,000 and then everybody else down here. It's some type of melding or joining together the two into one. And so on that basis alone, it's not Jehovah's Witness doctrine. What our brethren teach is that there's one thing, and the Jehovah's Witnesses teach that there's two separate things, and only a small group gets to go up here, and everybody else is down here in the lower regions. And I think they think that God the Father is going to stay up here, and that Jesus is going to be down here with the rest of us. That even the Father and the Son are going to be separated. So this is not Jehovah's Witness doctrine. All right, and so you see there in the third paragraph, the aforementioned view of our brethren in no way resembles that of Jehovah's Witnesses, and it does a discussion of truth no service when brethren make. And by the way, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about some of my preaching brethren. Make ignorant and unwarranted claims to impugn the views of their fellows. In other words, preachers who ought to know better and call this, by the way, when I wrote that note, you remember back when you could write Facebook notes, which were kind of lengthy things and you could just go to them at any time? They discontinued those not long after I wrote that one in 19. I got crucified. Now, none of you know this because none of you run in the same circles that I do, religiously speaking. But I got crucified I was scheduled to be on television on Gospel Broadcast Network in Memphis, Tennessee. And I wrote that note, and some of them people up there in Memphis lost their mind. And to be forthright, I told them, I said, look, if me being on TV, after writing this note is going to be a problem, you can rescind your invitation. And they did immediately. All right? Some knucklehead went to the Lubbock lectures and quoted my note and just butchered it horribly. Called me by name, read the note to him and his 15 people in the audience. But, one guy associated with the Christian Courier accused me of teaching Jehovah's Witness doctrine. It's just insane. It was just insane. And all I said was, first of all, the thing I said was, I don't believe this doctrine. That was where I started. I don't believe this doctrine. But people need to treat one another better than they're treating one another over this, because in the end, not a one of us knows with any degree of certainty what heaven's going to be like. Nobody. And this is only a discussion of what heaven is going to be like. Like I said, it doesn't have anything to do with what a person has to do to be saved. It doesn't have anything to do with the church in any shape, form, or fashion. Christian living, none of that. And as such, people ought to be free to make up their own minds. By the way, y'all don't know it, but there's been guys that have held meetings here who hold that view. They hold that view. Now, just to be forthright, I said, look, don't mention this while you're here. All you're going to do is confuse people. I said, let me confuse the people when I get good and ready. And so tonight's the night. Tonight's the night. Good. Not good, but you know what I mean. Look, I believe the same. I believe the same thing all of you believe, because that's what I've been teaching here for 28 years, right? I mean, whatever you believe about heaven is what you've heard me preach over the last nearly 3 decades. I just wanted you to know that there's another view out there that's gaining some popularity and getting some traction. And if you hear about it, just understand now you have some semblance of an idea of what it is. As I would say, just leave it alone. Come on, bub. All right, so next week. No, not next week. 2 weeks. Next week is Tuesday night singing. We'll pick up in question 15. See what? Be December the 3rd. Is that right? Whatever the first Wednesday in December is. 4th. Thank you.